In the nonprofit regional theater, the number of women leaders has hovered around 25% for decades. The number has not shifted. So we wanted to look deeper into why that was at that level and what could be done to change that number and shift it. This study was commissioned by the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. When we started the study in 2013, there were 74 similar theaters. We looked at who was employed in those theaters, and we did several surveys. When we talked to people in the industry, professionals in the industry, and we reminded them that there was 25% female leadership, they were shocked. Because when they look around at the employment of women in theaters, they see women at every level of employment in those theaters. They see qualified women just below leadership. In fact, on the operational side of the theaters, women outnumber men 2-to-1 in the positions just below leadership. On the artistic side, they are there in equal numbers with men. So why are they not in leadership? The reason there are so few women in leadership in the theaters is not a question of merit, because they are there. The women are there in very high numbers. There is not a pipeline issue in this industry. It is a pure glass ceiling issue. So we found in our research the dearth of women in leadership in the theaters is not a question of merit. It is a question of trust. The board selection committees trust women in leadership much less than they do men. A wonderful surprise was that more than half of the female directors showed us that they were artistic directors of a theater they had founded themselves. And this explained a lot to us. Women create their own leadership positions. They are not selected for the leadership positions that are available. So in the wide variety of directors in the United States, there are a large number of women who are very qualified leaders because they founded their own theater. As the founder of a theater, you learn to do everything. You are an extremely qualified candidate for leadership at a larger theater, like the nonprofit theaters. But what stands in the way of these women making it to that leadership level is, again, the trust of the selection committee. When we looked at the career paths of men and women in our sample, we found that when a woman was at a theater, when there was an opening for the leadership and she had been working there in a lower position, she made a much higher chance at being promoted to the leadership position than a man was. We translate this into familiarity has generated trust. Her work was familiar, and therefore she could be trusted as a leader. So women were promoted into leadership positions within their theater at much higher rates, statistically significantly higher rates than men. In the study, we looked at underrepresentation, and we saw that women were underrepresented in leadership. But when we looked more closely, we especially saw that people of color were underrepresented in leadership. In fact, it was very easy to count them. There were 6 people of color in leadership in these 74 theaters. None of them were on the operational sides of these theaters. There were 5 men of color, and there was 1 woman of color. There is a grave absence of people of color in these larger nonprofit theaters. So there isn't only a glass ceiling issue for people of color. In fact, there are people of color who are in positions just below leadership, both on the operational and on the artistic side of these theaters. But there are very few people of color in what we would call the pipeline toward the leadership throughout the levels of employment of the regional theaters. So for people of color, there is a dual problem. There is the glass ceiling problem, and there is the pipeline problem. One exciting finding in our survey was that the women of color reported being less intimidated by development work. And we would think that that skill is a very important skill for a nonprofit theater that really depends in large part on donations and people who can bring in those donations. So knowing that people of color, women of color especially, feels comfortable doing that would seem to really work in their benefit as being candidates for leadership. Building on women of color's familiarity and comfort with fundraising is their report of also being comfortable bringing in communities of different backgrounds. In fact, when we interviewed people, the women of color especially told us of particular programs, models that they had created to bring in communities of color who had not been addressed by their theaters. And that was just a wonderful, striking finding. And again, it should give them a leg up. We have some recommendations in changing what leadership looks like in theater. Confront and recognize the hidden biases that are present in a selection process. We all have unconscious biases. And the way to do that the most easily is to have anonymous surveys among your staff and find out what is happening in terms of biases, in terms of stereotypes that your staff are experiencing. And then take the results of those surveys and address the issues of those biases. Another way is to start an internal diversity committee. It creates a social accountability system such that diversity is at the front and the center of every conversation, even the selection conversations. One of the striking findings in our research is that nobody talks about their family responsibilities. There is a taboo against talking about taking care of a child, taking care of another person in one's family. When we can't talk about family responsibility, that really impedes people who have those responsibilities. So we need to have a conversation about work-life balance. And we need to include in that conversation childcare, care for other family members. We need a culture shift in our society about the assumptions we have of people who take care of others. We need to have the same assumptions of men and women of how they will balance their work and life.